I never believed in evil until the night I chose to protect it or what I thought was evil, and discovered that everything I'd been taught about darkness and light had been turned upside down. The rain, the sound that would shatter my understanding of reality, a low, guttural breathing coming from inside my father's old barn, accompanied by the distant thunder of military helicopters, slicing through the storm-darkened sky. My hands were shaking as I pushed open that weathered door, the rusty hinges screaming into the wind, and what I saw huddled in the corner among the hay bales made my blood run cold, and my spirit burn with an inexplicable recognition I couldn't name. There, bleeding and broken, was a being that shouldn't exist according to everything I'd learned in church, in school, in the safe boundaries of my small-town life. His scales caught the dim light like ancient armor, golden green and iridescent, and his eyes, God help me, his eyes held an intelligence and a sorrow so profound that I felt my soul crack open. Just meeting his gaze, this wasn't a demon, though every instinct screamed that it should be. This was something else entirely, something that made my heart pound not just with fear, but with a strange, sacred curiosity that felt like destiny knocking on the door of my ordinary existence. The helicopters were getting closer, their searchlights cutting through the cracks in the barn walls, like accusing fingers from heaven, and I knew in that moment that men with guns were hunting this creature with the kind of desperation that told me he carried something they desperately wanted to keep hidden. He was clutching his side where dark blood seeped between his clawed fingers, and when our eyes locked, I felt a jolt of connection that transcended language, species, and every wall I'd ever built. Around my heart, my father had been a man of secrets, a veteran who'd seen things he never spoke about, who'd built a hidden room beneath this very barn for reasons he took to his grave 3 years ago. Standing there in that charged moment, with the sound of boots hitting mud somewhere beyond my property line, I understood with crystal clarity that this was no accident, that somehow, impossibly, this encounter had been written into the fabric of my life long before I was born. The rational part of my mind was screaming to run, to call the authorities, to protect myself and my family name from whatever conspiracy was unfolding on my land. But there was another voice, quieter and infinitely more powerful, whispering through my spirit like wind through wheat fields. This being is not your enemy. He is a messenger, and you must listen. 1 found myself moving toward him against every survival instinct, my legs carrying me forward as if guided by invisible hands. And when I knelt beside him in that hay-strewn corner, I smelled something strange, not unpleasant, but ancient, like stone and starlight, and something that reminded me of the incense from my grandmother's Catholic church. His breathing was labored, each inhale a struggle, and up close I could see the sophistication of his form. This was no animal, no mindless beast, but a being whose very existence challenged the neat categories I'd used to organize reality. The searchlights swept across the barn exterior, and I heard voices shouting coordinates, tactical jargon that made my stomach clench with the realization that these weren't local police. This was military, maybe something beyond military, something that operated in the shadows of official reality. Without thinking, without planning, I made a choice that would alter the trajectory of my entire existence. I wrapped my jacket round his wounded torso, whispered "trust me," and helped him to his feet, if you could call them feet supporting his weight, as we stumbled toward the false floor panel my father had installed decades ago. In that moment of decision, as I committed an act that could be called treason or madness or divine obedience, depending on who was telling the story, I felt something shift in the spiritual atmosphere around us, as if angels and demons alike were holding their breath to see what happened next. The basement smelled of earth and secrets as I lowered him down into the darkness, my muscles screaming with the effort of supporting his considerable weight. And just before I closed the panel above us, I saw the first beam of a flashlight pierce through the barn door. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. And as I crouched beside this impossible being in the pitch-black underground chamber my father had built for purposes I'd never understood, I realized I had just crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. The helicopters roared overhead, shaking dust from the wooden beams above, and in the suffocating darkness, I felt his clawed hand reach out and gently touch my forearm, a gesture so unexpectedly tender it brought tears to my eyes. Something was happening, something that transcended this moment of physical danger, something that felt like the hand of God reaching through the chaos to say, pay attention. Everything you think you know is about to change. I closed my eyes and prayed, not knowing if I was praying for salvation or forgiveness, for protection or understanding, knowing only that I had just stepped into a mystery that would either destroy me or reveal truths that humanity had forgotten in our long stumble through history. Above us, I heard boots on the barn floor, voices demanding entry to my home, and beside me in the darkness, this reptilian being began to do something I never expected. He began to speak, not with words, but directly into the deepest chambers of my mind. The voice that entered my mind was nothing like I imagined telepathy would be. It wasn't an intrusion or a violation, but rather like remembering something I'd always known but had forgotten, like finding a letter written in my own handwriting that I had no memory of composing. His consciousness touched mine with a gentleness that contradicted everything his fearsome appearance suggested, and I suddenly understood that communication between souls required no tongue, no translation, only openness and the willingness to receive truth without the filters of prejudice and fear. Above us, the soldiers were tearing through my barn, overturning equipment, shouting orders with an urgency that bordered on panic, and I realized they weren't just searching for an escaped creature, they were hunting someone who had stolen something infinitely precious, something worth mobilizing entire military units in the dead of night. In that hidden basement that smelled of my father's cigarettes and old motor oil, I pressed my back against the cold stone wall and opened my mind to this being who had somehow become my sacred responsibility. His thoughts flowed into mine like warm water, carrying images and emotions that made my previous understanding of reality seem like a child's crayon drawing compared to a master's oil painting. I saw flashes of massive underground facilities, laboratories where beings like him worked alongside human scientists, and programs that existed outside the awareness of ordinary citizens. Projects that dealt with consciousness itself, as if it were a tangible substance that could be measured, modified, and controlled. The weight of secrecy pressed down on me as I absorbed these revelations, understanding that my father's hidden room had been built not from paranoia, but from dangerous knowledge, that perhaps he too had been touched by truths that required concealment in a world not ready to receive them. Do not fear what I am about to show you. His voice whispered through my consciousness, carrying an accent that seemed to exist outside of human language, ancient and musical and tinged with an emotion I could only describe as holy grief. Your species has been told that you are alone in the universe, that consciousness rose by accident from dead matter, that you are nothing more than sophisticated animals awaiting extinction. But these are lies, designed to keep you small, to keep you manageable, to prevent you from discovering your true heritage as children of the Most High. As he spoke directly into my soul, I felt the floorboards above us shudder with heavy footsteps, heard my front door being kicked open, heard strange electronic equipment beeping as they searched for heat signatures or energy readings, or whatever technology they used to hunt beings like him. My breathing came in shallow gasps as I struggled to process both the physical danger and the metaphysical revolution happening simultaneously, my worldview cracking like ice beneath spring sun, revealing waters deeper and stranger than any theology I'd learned in Sunday school. He showed me, then not told me, but showed me through direct transmission of experience, visions of his kind walking among humanity's earliest civilizations, not as gods but as watchers, as guides appointed by a divine authority that transcended any single species or world. I saw beings like him teaching ancient humans about agriculture, astronomy, sacred geometry, helping to midwife humanity's evolution from tribal bands to civilization builders, always working within strict boundaries established by what he called the eternal sovereign, the source of all consciousness, the being my tradition named God. The vision was so vivid I could smell the desert wind of ancient Mesopotamia, could feel the sandstone walls of temples where human and non-human intelligences collaborated in a partnership that history had erased, could sense the profound respect with which these reptilian beings regarded humanity not as cattle or slaves, but as younger siblings in a cosmic family united under one divine father. Then the vision darkened, and I felt his anguish like a knife in my chest as he revealed the fracture, the rebellion, the moment when certain factions of his kind and others decided they would rather rule than serve, would rather harvest human consciousness like a crop than protect its sacred development. We are not all the same. He communicated with an intensity that made my temples throb. Just as humans are not all saints or all sinners, my kind is divided between those who honor the divine mandate to protect and guide, and those who have fallen into the ancient temptation to control and consume, to position themselves as gods rather than servants of the one true God. I saw through his memories a cosmos teeming with intelligent life, dozens of species and civilizations, all navigating the same fundamental choice that humans faced, to align with the light of divine love or to grasp for power through manipulation and fear. My hands were trembling as I grasped the magnitude of what he was sharing, that the spiritual warfare my pastors had preached about wasn't metaphorical but achingly literal, playing out not just in human hearts, but across star systems and dimensions. A conflict as old as free will itself. The soldiers upstairs were getting frustrated, their voices sharp with the knowledge that their quarry had seemingly vanished, and I pressed my palm against the wooden panel above us, praying with everything in me that they wouldn't discover my father's final gift to me, this sanctuary that now sheltered a truth too dangerous for the powers of this world to allow. Your father knew. The reptilian's voice came again, softer now, tinged with respect and sorrow. He was touched by this knowledge in his military service and spent his life trying to atone for what he participated in, trying to build places of refuge for the day when the truth would need protection. Tears streamed down my face as I finally understood my father's silences, his nightmares, his obsessive construction projects, that my mother had dismissed as the hobbies of a troubled veteran. He had been preparing the way, building an ark of stone and wood for the preservation of revelations that the world's systems were engineered to suppress. This being beside me, wounded and hunted, represented a threat not to humanity's safety, but to humanity's slavery, to the carefully constructed illusions that kept billions of souls locked in fear, distraction, and spiritual amnesia. I felt something awakening in my own consciousness, dormant capacities stirring like seeds recognizing spring, and I understood with sudden clarity that this encounter was not random, that my entire life had been a preparation for this moment, that the prayers I'd whispered in churches and the questions I'd been afraid to voice had been heard by a God whose love was stranger, wilder, and more wonderful than any doctrine had captured. Above us, I heard the soldiers finally retreat, their helicopters lifting off with a roar that faded into the storm. But I knew this was only a temporary reprieve, that they would return with more sophisticated equipment, that the clock was ticking on both our lives and on something infinitely larger, the awakening of a species to its true identity. The silence after the helicopters departed felt heavier than their presence, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of secrets too long buried. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the confined space of the basement, could smell the metallic tang of the reptilian's blood mixed with something else, something like ozone, an ancient incense, a scent that seemed to exist between the physical and spiritual realms. He shifted slightly, his golden eyes fixing on mine with an intensity that made me feel simultaneously exposed and seen, in a way no human gaze had ever achieved, as if he were reading not just my thoughts, but the entire story of my soul written in light only he could perceive. I need to show you the beginning. His voice whispered through my consciousness. Not the beginning you were taught in sterile classrooms or even in your churches, but the true genesis of your kind, the covenant that was made before your recorded history, the agreement that shaped your very DNA and destiny. My rational mind wanted to resist, wanted to catalog all the reasons this couldn't be real, but something deeper in me, something that felt older than my 37 years, recognized that I was standing at a threshold that demanded either complete surrender to truth or a retreat into comfortable ignorance. He raised one clawed hand slowly, palm facing me, and I watched in fascination as the scales seemed to shimmer and become translucent, revealing patterns of light moving beneath his skin like sacred geometry made living and breathing. Before I could ask what he was doing, his consciousness flooded mine with such force that I gasped, my back arching against the stone wall as visions poured through me like water through a broken dam. I was no longer in my father's basement, but standing in a council chamber that existed outside norm, space and time, a place where the walls themselves seemed to be made of crystallized starlight and the floor reflected dimensions my eyes couldn't properly comprehend. Beings of various forms sat in a vast circle, some humanoid, some reptilian like my companion, others composed of pure geometric light, patterns that hurt to perceive directly, and at the center of this assembly was a presence so magnificent and terrible that I couldn't look at it directly, could only sense its edges, its overwhelming love mixed with an authority that made every created thing bow in reverence. This is the divine council, Asterisk the reptilian's voice narrated through the vision. Asterisk where the eternal sovereign your God, the God of all creation meets with the principalities and powers appointed to govern the unfolding of cosmic history. Asterisk I watched in awe as the luminous center spoke, though the language was beyond words, communicating in frequencies that carried meaning directly into the soul. And I understood that a decision was being made about Earth, about humanity, about creating a species that would be something unprecedented in the cosmos. The vision showed me human DNA being designed not by random mutation, but by divine intention, crafted to contain within its spiral structure the capacity to house both material and eternal consciousness, to bridge heaven and earth in a way no other species had been designed to do. Tears streamed down my face as I understood that humans weren't accidents or cosmic mistakes but intentional masterpieces, created to be dwelling places for the divine presence, temples of living flesh meant to manifest God's love throughout physical reality. The vision shifted, and I saw the early days of humanity, when the veil between worlds was thinner and communication between human and non-human intelligences was regular and understood. Representatives of various species, including reptilians like my companion, walked openly among humans as appointed guardians and teachers, all operating under strict mandates from the divine council to nurture and protect humanity's development without interfering with free will or replacing the direct relationship each human could have with their creator. Asterisk we were never meant to be worshipped. Asterisk he communicated with fierce emphasis. Asterisk that was the line that could not be crossed. We could teach, guide, share knowledge, but the moment any of us accepted worship or positioned ourselves between humans and the Most High, we violated the sacred covenant and fell from our appointed purpose. Asterisk I watched the tragedy unfold as certain beings, drunk on the admiration and fear humans showed them, began to demand worship, to present themselves as gods, to manipulate human genetics and consciousness for their own agendas rather than according to divine design. The grief in my companion's consciousness was palpable as he showed me how this rebellion fractured the ancient partnership, how humans came to fear all non-human intelligence, how the memory of the original covenant was systematically erased and replaced with stories that painted all such beings as demons or devils. I understood then that my reptilian companion was part of a faithful remnant, those who had refused to break the covenant, who still honored their assignment to protect humanity even from the shadows, even while being hunted by both their fallen kin and by human authorities, who couldn't distinguish between friend and foe. He released me from the vision gently, and I collapsed forward, gasping as if I'd been underwater, my mind struggling to contain the enormity of what I'd experienced. My hands were shaking as I looked at him with new eyes, seeing not a monster, but a devoted servant, an elder brother, who had sacrificed everything to remain faithful to a divine mandate given before my ancestors. Learn to write. Asterisk now you understand why they hunt me. Asterisk he communicated quietly. Asterisk I carry proof of the covenant, records and genetic keys that would help humanity remember what they were designed to be. And there are forces both human and non-human, who have built entire empires on keeping your species locked in spiritual amnesia, cut off from your true heritage as children of the living God. Asterisk the weight of responsibility settled on my shoulders like a physical thing as I realized I was no longer just a witness, but a participant, that this knowledge now living in my consciousness made me dangerous to the principalities and powers that govern through deception and fear. Outside, false dawn was beginning to lighten the sky, and I knew we had only hours before they returned, with equipment sophisticated enough to penetrate even my father's carefully constructed sanctuary. Yet in that hidden basement, wounded alien and frightened human sat together in a silence that felt like prayer, two unlikely allies united by loyalty to a truth older and more precious than either of our species, the truth that love, not control, was the foundation of all creation, and that the God we both served was faithful to his promises even when his children forgot them. The reptilian's breathing grew more labored, and I could see the bluish tint spreading beneath his scales where the wound on his side continued to seep despite my crude bandaging attempts. His golden eyes dimmed momentarily before flaring with renewed intensity, as if he were drawing on reserves deeper than physical strength, tapping into something that transcended flesh and bone. Asterisk there is more you must understand. Asterisk his consciousness pressed into mine with urgency that made my pulse quicken. Asterisk not all of my kind remained faithful to the covenant just as not all humans who speak of God truly serve his purposes. Asterisk, the weight of his words settled over me like a shroud as he began to show me images of boardrooms and underground facilities. Places where humans in expensive suits made deals with reptilian beings whose eyes held no warmth, no reverence, only cold calculation. I watched in horror as these rogue factions planned and schemed, humans and reptilians together forming an alliance built not on divine mandate, but on mutual greed and the intoxicating drug of power over others. The vision made me nauseous because I recognized some of the human faces from news broadcasts, from positions of authority I had been taught to trust and respect. Asterisk, they have been working for generations to keep your species docile. Asterisk, he continued. Asterisk, using entertainment to numb your minds, manipulating your food and water to calcify the spiritual centers of your brain, engineering conflicts and divisions to ensure you never unite in the consciousness of who you truly are. Asterisk, the basement suddenly felt suffocatingly small as I grappled with the implications of what he was showing me, my worldview cracking and reforming like ice under pressure. He projected images of humanity on the verge of a great awakening, showing me pockets of people across the globe who were beginning to question the narratives they had been fed, who were turning away from the distractions and seeking direct connection with the divine presence that had always dwelt within them. Asterisk, this is what they fear most. Asterisk, his voice carried both hope and desperation. Asterisk, humans who discover they were never meant to be slaves or even merely servants, but sons and daughters of the Most High, co-heirs with Christ to a kingdom not of this corrupted world but of eternal reality. Asterisk, I saw through his eyes how human DNA contained sequences that remained inactive in most people, coded locks waiting for the right frequency of consciousness to open them, frequencies activated through prayer, through genuine love, through the surrender of ego that allowed divine nature to flow unobstructed through human vessels. The rogue faction's entire strategy depended on keeping humanity locked in lower frequencies of fear, shame, anger, and division, emotions that fed certain interdimensional entities while keeping the divine codes dormant and humanity weak. Asterisk, your scriptures speak truth when they say you wrestle not against flesh and blood. Asterisk, he communicated with fierce conviction. Asterisk, but against principalities and powers in heavenly places. This war is not truly physical, but spiritual, fought in the realm of consciousness and choice. Asterisk, my hands clenched into fists as righteous anger began to replace my fear, a holy fire kindling in my chest as I understood the magnitude of the deception that had been perpetrated against my species. Yet even in my anger, I felt the reptilian's consciousness gently redirect me, showing me that rage itself could become a trap, another low frequency that fed the very forces we opposed. Asterisk, the Creator's way is different. Asterisk, he reminded me with a tenderness that seemed impossible from such an alien form. Asterisk, his son demonstrated the path when he walked among you, not domination but service, not violence but sacrificial love, not control but liberation through truth that sets the captive free. Asterisk, I thought of Jesus cleansing the temple, of how his anger was always directed at systems that kept people from accessing the Father, never at the broken people themselves. And I understood that what I was being called to was not warfare in the conventional sense, but to become a living witness to truth, a light that exposes darkness simply by shining. The reptilian showed me that every human who awakened to their true divine identity, who chose love over fear and unity over division, weakened the control grid and strengthened the frequency of heaven on earth. Asterisk, this is why they want to silence me. Asterisk, he said, his physical form growing weaker even as his spiritual presence seemed to intensify. Asterisk, I carry not weapons but keys, frequencies and knowledge that can help accelerate the awakening they have worked so hard to prevent. Asterisk, a sudden noise from upstairs made us both freeze, and I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy boots on my porch, followed by aggressive pounding on my front door. The reptilian's eyes met mine with an expression I can only describe as profound peace mixed with sorrowful resolve, and I knew without words that our time was running out faster than either of us had hoped. Asterisk, you must decide now. Asterisk, his consciousness wrapped around mine like an embrace. Asterisk, whether the comfortable illusion of safety is worth more than the dangerous beauty of truth, whether you will protect your temporary life or risk everything for the eternal liberation of your kind. Asterisk, my father's voice echoed in my memory, his deathbed words about some truths being worth dying for, about how real faith always costs everything and gives back more than can be measured. The pounding upstairs grew more insistent, and I heard wood beginning to splinter as they prepared to force entry. But in that basement sanctuary I felt more clarity than I had known in years. I looked at the wounded being before me, this faithful servant who had given everything to honor an ancient covenant with my Creator, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would not betray him, could not betray the truth he carried even if it meant my own destruction, because some things matter more than survival, and the freedom of humanity's soul was worth any price they could demand of my flesh. The pounding upstairs faded into background noise as the reptilian's consciousness enveloped mine, with an intensity that felt like diving into an ocean of living memory, and suddenly I was no longer in my father's basement, but witnessing the dawn of human history through eyes that had observed from the shadows for millennia. I saw the garden, not as a simple paradise, but as a dimensional convergence point, where heaven and earth overlapped perfectly, where the first humans walked in full awareness of their divine nature, their DNA singing with activated codes that allowed them to communicate directly with the Creator, and exercise dominion not through domination but through harmonic co-creation with all living things. The serpent in the garden appeared in my vision, but not as a simple snake, rather as representatives of my companions' ancient ancestors, who had been tasked with testing and strengthening humanity's will, ensuring that our choice to love and obey God came from genuine devotion rather than mere programming or inability to choose otherwise. But I saw how some of these watchers became corrupted by pride, how they began to whisper half-truths mixed with lies, offering knowledge without wisdom, power without responsibility, pleasure without the sanctifying context of divine purpose. The fall that followed wasn't merely about eating forbidden fruit, but about humanity choosing to believe we could become like God through our own efforts rather than accepting we were already made in His image and needed only to surrender to that truth and let it transform us from the inside out. I witnessed how the act of rebellion caused a literal change in human consciousness, how frequencies shifted and the divine codes within our DNA began to go dormant, like lights being switched off one by one, until humanity could no longer perceive the spiritual dimensions we had been designed to navigate. As naturally as we breathed air, the vision intensified and I watched through countless generations, as my reptilian companions' faithful ancestors worked to preserve remnants of truth, appearing to prophets and seers, guiding the bloodline that would eventually bring forth the promised Messiah, who could restore what had been broken and reactivate what had gone dormant in humanity's divine design. I saw Abraham and Moses and David through these ancient eyes, understanding now why Scripture spoke of angels and divine messengers in forms that sometimes seem strange or terrifying, recognizing that the faithful reptilians had been among those servants of the Most High who delivered warnings and revelations and protection to those through whom God was working His redemptive plan. The knowledge flooded through me that human beings were never meant to be merely physical creatures, scratching out existence on a spinning rock, but were designed as bridges between heaven and earth, beings with feet in the material world, but hearts and minds capable of touching eternity, processing divine frequencies and manifesting heaven's reality into the corrupted physical realm through our choices and consciousness. Our DNA itself was a masterpiece of divine engineering, containing within its spiraling structure not just biological information, but spiritual receivers and transmitters, antennas designed to pick up the frequencies of God's voice and broadcast His love and truth into every cell of our bodies and out into the world around us. I finally understood why the rogue factions worked so tirelessly to corrupt human bodies with toxins and human minds with lies, because a human operating in full divine potential was more powerful than any weapon or technology they possessed, capable of shifting reality itself through faith-filled words and actions aligned with the Creator's heart and purposes. The reptilian guided my awareness deeper still, and I saw the moment when Christ walked the earth. But now I perceived dimensions of that event I had never glimpsed in all my years of Sunday school and Bible reading. Jesus appeared in the vision not just as a man or even as God in flesh, but as a cosmic reset key, the perfect human whose DNA contained all the divine codes in their fully activated and functional state, demonstrating what humanity was always meant to be and creating through His death and resurrection a spiritual bridge by which all humans could have their own dormant codes reactivated and their broken connection to the Father completely restored. I watched in awe as His sacrifice sent out a frequency wave that rippled through all of time and space, past and future simultaneously, making available to every human who would receive it the power to become children of God in more than just poetic language, but in literal transformed consciousness and reactivated Divine nature. The Reptilian showed me how the early church had operated in these restored frequencies, performing signs and wonders not through their own power, but because they had surrendered to the indwelling presence of Christ and allowed the divine codes within them to function as originally designed, making them conduits of heaven's reality, breaking into earth's darkness. I saw how over centuries the institutional structures had often obscured this truth, teaching people to worship Jesus rather than follow his example, and instruction to do even greater works, keeping believers dependent on external religious authority rather than awakening to the direct relationship with the Reptilian's clawed hand trembled as it reached toward my forehead, and I felt the cool scales make contact with my skin just as the voices upstairs grew louder and more urgent. Soldiers shouting coordinates and search patterns while I knelt here on the edge of the greatest revelation of my existence. His telepathic voice grew softer, almost tender, as he began to show me the mechanics of what had been done to humanity over generations, not through complex scientific jargon, but through feelings and images that bypassed my logical mind, and spoke directly to something deeper within me that recognized truth the way a flower recognizes sunlight. I saw our modern world as if from a great height, watching invisible frequencies bombarding humanity from every direction through screens and towers and processed foods, each designed not to kill us outright, but to keep us vibrating at lower frequencies of fear and anger and despair, because these frequencies created static that interfered with our ability to perceive spiritual reality or access the dormant divine codes written into every strand of our DNA. The Reptilian's sorrow washed over me as he revealed how his rogue brothers had infiltrated systems of power and convinced humans to poison their own species, to flood developing minds with images of violence and hopelessness, to replace real human connection with digital simulation, all because a humanity operating in love and unity and direct communion with God represented an unstoppable force that would end their reign of manipulation forever. He showed me then what those divine codes actually were, not as abstract religious concepts, but as literal sequences within our genetic structure that functioned as tuning forks for different frequencies of consciousness and awareness, each one designed to unlock specific capacities that would allow humans to fulfill our original purpose as co-creators and stewards of physical reality infused with heaven's presence. I saw how the code for unconditional love, when activated, literally changed the electromagnetic field around a human heart and influenced the thoughts and feelings of everyone nearby, creating ripples of transformation that could shift entire communities. If enough individuals awaken to this capacity within themselves, the code for divine creativity, when functioning properly, allowed humans to download solutions and inventions and artistic expressions directly from the mind of God, which explained how the greatest breakthroughs in human history always seemed to come as sudden inspiration or dreams that gave people knowledge they had no natural way of accessing. The Reptilian revealed that fear was the master lock that kept all these codes suppressed, because fear contracted our energy field and caused us to focus on survival and self-protection rather than expansion and divine purpose, which was precisely why the systems of control worked so hard to keep humanity in perpetual states of anxiety about money and health and safety and what others thought of us. I felt tears streaming down my face as he gently turned my awareness toward the mechanism of reactivation, showing me that Christ had not come merely to provide fire insurance against hell, but to literally restore our factory settings, to make it possible for the divine codes to come back online in any human who surrendered their false self and allowed his spirit to take up residence within them and begin the reconstruction process. The Reptilian showed me believers who had accessed these codes throughout history, ordinary people who suddenly found themselves healing the sick or prophesying future events or manifesting provision in impossible circumstances, not because they were special or more deserving, but simply because they had believed God's promises enough to step out in faith and discover that the power really was available and really did work when applied according to the kingdom principles Jesus had demonstrated and taught. I understood now why Scripture spoke of renewing the mind and taking every thought captive, because our thoughts were not just mental activities, but actual creative forces that either aligned with the divine frequencies and activated our spiritual DNA, or aligned with fear frequencies and kept us locked in limited material consciousness. The knowledge settling into my bones was that humanity stood at a threshold moment, where enough people were beginning to question the official narratives and hunger for deeper truth that a great awakening was actually possible. but only if those who understood would be brave enough to live. As walking demonstrations of what activated divine DNA looked like in practical daily existence. The reptilian's strength was fading rapidly now, and I could feel his life force ebbing even as his consciousness remained intertwined with mine. And he pressed into my awareness one final critical truth that made everything else click into place with stunning clarity. He showed me that the battle for Earth was not ultimately about territory or resources or even which species would dominate, but about whether humanity would remember who we really were and step into our identity as children of the Most High. Because the moment enough humans operated from activated divine codes, the frequency of the entire planet would shift, and the dark powers that had fed on our fear and division would simply have no more food source and no more authority. In a realm saturated with the presence and power of the living God, I saw that my own life up until this moment had been preparation for this exact encounter. Every loss and disappointment serving to strip away my attachment to the world's empty promises, so that I would be ready to receive and carry this dangerous and liberating truth. The weight of responsibility settled on me like a mantle as I recognized that I could not unknow what had been revealed, could not return to comfortable ignorance now that I understood the staggering potential locked inside every human walking the planet, and the cosmic significance of whether we chose fear or faith in the coming days. The sound of boots hitting the wooden floor above us shattered the sacred stillness of our communion, each heavy footfall sending dust particles drifting down through the cracks in the old ceiling, as harsh voices barked orders about securing the perimeter and checking every structure on the property. The reptilian's golden eyes met mine with an intensity that communicated everything without words, and I felt the terrible weight of the choice now pressing down on my chest like a physical force. Because staying here meant certain discovery and probably death, while abandoning him meant protecting my own life, but betraying the truth that could set countless souls free. My father's voice echoed in my memory from childhood, telling me that a man's character is revealed not in moments of comfort, but in the split seconds when everything hangs in the balance, and there's no time to calculate consequences or weigh options according to self-interest. The reptilian's scaled hand squeezed my arm gently, and through our telepathic connection I felt him releasing me from any obligation, giving me permission to save myself and leave him to whatever fate awaited. But even as he offered this escape, I knew with crystalline certainty that I could not take it, because something had fundamentally shifted inside me during our encounter, and the person who might have chosen safety no longer existed. Above us, a door slammed and someone shouted about checking the basement, their voice close enough that I could hear the radio static crackling between their words, and I found myself moving not away from danger but deeper into it, positioning my body between the reptilian and the stairs as if my flesh could serve as any kind of shield against what was coming. The absurdity of my situation would have made me laugh if terror wasn't squeezing my lungs, because here I was preparing to defend a creature that every rational part of my mind still classified as impossible, risking everything I had for a being whose very existence contradicted the comfortable version of reality I had inhabited just hours earlier. Yet beneath the fear something else was rising, a strange calm that felt like cool water flowing up from a deep underground source, and I recognized it as the same presence I had felt in church as a child, when the Spirit moved during worship, and everything seemed more real and vivid and true than ordinary life ever managed to be. The reptilian's telepathic voice whispered that I was experiencing the activation of one of my divine codes, the sequence that allowed humans to move in supernatural courage not because they felt no fear, but because they perceived a reality beyond the physical threats, and understood that some things mattered more than biological survival. I thought of the disciples, who had walked to their executions singing hymns, of missionaries who had held firm under torture rather than deny what they knew to be true, and I finally understood that their strength had not been exceptional human willpower, but this exact same activation of spiritual DNA that allowed them to see with kingdom eyes even as earthly powers closed in around them. The stairs creaked and I heard someone testing the basement door, rattling the handle that my father had always kept locked, and I knew we had perhaps 30 seconds before they forced it open and found us here in this concrete tomb that had become a cathedral of revelation. Through our connection I felt the reptilian making some kind of internal decision, a resolve forming in his consciousness that carried the weight of finality and sacrifice, and before I could understand what he intended, a wave of energy pulsed from his body and washed through the basement like invisible fire. The single bulb overhead flickered wildly, and I heard electronic equipment above us begin to malfunction, radios squealing with feedback and someone cursing about their night vision goggles suddenly going dark, and I realized he was using the last of his strength to create an electromagnetic disruption that would buy us precious moments, but would also certainly reveal his exact location to anyone with the right detection equipment. His golden eyes were dimming now, the light behind them fading like a candle burning down to its final centimeter of wax, and his telepathic voice came through weak but determined as he told me that his mission had never been escape but delivery, that he had allowed himself to be chased to this specific location because the ancient knowledge his people carried needed a keeper, and I had been identified long ago as one whose heart could receive it, and whose courage might sustain the burden of sharing it. The basement door splintered above us with a crack that sounded like lightning striking wood, and I heard orders being shouted about securing the target and watching for hostile movement, but the reptilian's clawed hand was already reaching for my forehead again, his touch more urgent now, and I surrendered to whatever he needed to give me because I finally understood that this moment had been written into the fabric of reality long before my birth, and resistance was not rebellion but abdication of purpose. The knowledge hit my consciousness like a meteor, impact not gradual or gentle but catastrophic and transforming, rewriting neural pathways and burning new truths into my understanding with an intensity that bordered on physical pain, even as it carried the sweetness of ultimate meaning. I saw in rapid sequence the faces of people I would meet in coming years, conversations I would have in coffee shops and parking lots, and late-night phone calls, each one a divine appointment where something I carried would unlock something dormant in another soul and set off chain reactions of awakening that would ripple forward through time in patterns too complex for human minds to track, but perfectly orchestrated by the intelligence that numbered every hair and knew every sparrow's fall. The reptilian showed me that this was how kingdom advancement actually worked, not through massive rallies or celebrity preachers or political movements, but through faithful individuals who carried activated divine codes and lived as frequency transmitters, their very presence raising the spiritual atmosphere around them and making it easier for others to perceive truth and respond to the Spirit's invitation. Heavy boots were pounding down the stairs now, and I could see tactical lights sweeping through the darkness, but I could not move or look away because the reptilian was showing me the most important piece of all, the vision of Christ that would sustain me through everything coming. And I wept as I finally saw him, not as the mild religious figure of stained glass windows, but as the cosmic warrior and liberator whose invasion of Earth had cracked the enemy's authority forever, and whose resurrection power was even now working to complete the restoration of all things according to the Father's original design. The reptilian's hand pressed harder against my forehead, and I felt something far beyond mere information being transferred, a living essence pouring from his consciousness into mine, like molten gold filling a mold, and the knowledge came not as abstract data, but as experiential memory that made me feel as though I had lived through centuries of hidden history in the span of seconds. I saw the moment of my own conception through spiritual eyes, watched as divine intelligence wove my DNA with intentional precision, encoding within my cells not just biological instructions, but spiritual frequencies calibrated to resonate with specific truths that humanity desperately needed to remember. And I understood finally that every human being was this intricate, that God's craftsmanship operated at levels so microscopically detailed and cosmically expansive that our minds could barely grasp the edges of his creative genius. The reptilian's telepathic voice became my own internal knowing as he showed me that certain souls were marked before birth as carriers, individuals whose life circumstances would position them at exact intersections of time and place, where their activated presence could catalyze awakening in others, prepared to receive, and the profound weight of purpose settled into my bones with a mixture of terror and exhilaration because I was witnessing the mechanics of divine orchestration operating behind the veil of ordinary existence. Above us, the tactical team was shouting about heat signatures and movement in the basement, their voices sharp with adrenaline and aggression, but their physical proximity felt strangely distant compared to the eternal realities unfolding in my expanding consciousness as the reptilian continued his desperate transfer of sacred stewardship. Through his fading strength, I experienced what could only be called a cosmic perspective, seeing Earth from angles that human eyes were never meant to witness, and I watched as streams of light moved between individuals across the planet, connections of prayer and intercession and spiritual influence creating networks of luminous threads that map the true kingdom infrastructure operating invisibly within and around the fallen systems of human civilization. The Reptilian showed me that these networks were expanding rapidly in recent years, accelerating toward some threshold of collective awakening that terrified the powers who had controlled humanity through deception and manufactured scarcity. And I finally understood why suppression of truth had become so aggressive, and why those who spoke about spiritual awakening and divine identity were increasingly marginalized or silenced by mechanisms both obvious and subtle. He let me feel the enemy's genuine fear, the panic rising among principalities and powers who recognized that human beings were beginning to remember who they really were, children of the Most High God embedded in physical form, to bring heaven's reality into material expression, and that once enough individuals activated their divine codes and started operating in kingdom authority, the old systems of control would collapse like houses built on sand when the tide finally turns. The vision showed me that Christ's incarnation had been the pivotal intervention, the moment when God himself entered the rigged game and rewrote the rules at the deepest level, his death and resurrection accomplishing something in the spiritual architecture of reality that made full human awakening not just possible but inevitable, though the timing remained dependent on human choice and cooperation with the Spirit's invitation to transformation. The Reptilian's golden eyes were flickering now like failing electricity, and through our connection I felt his life force ebbing away even as he pushed the last and most crucial downloads into my consciousness, images and understanding about what came next and what my specific role would require. In the years ahead, I saw myself speaking to small groups in living rooms and church basements, my words carrying an activation frequency that would unlock something dormant in certain listeners, and I witnessed moments when people's eyes would suddenly clear as though waking from sleep, and they would begin to perceive spiritual reality with new acuity that transformed their entire orientation to existence and purpose. The Reptilian whispered telepathically that this was my inheritance and calling, to serve as a living key that opened locks in other human hearts, not through my own charisma or intelligence but through the divine codes, now fully activated within me that would resonate with corresponding frequencies in those appointed to hear. And he showed me that thousands of other carriers were being awakened simultaneously across the planet in preparation for the great harvest of souls that Scripture had prophesied and that even now was beginning to manifest. I wept at the beauty of it, the intricate coordination of divine strategy operating across millennia and continents, using even the enemy's schemes to accomplish purposes those dark powers could never comprehend. And I finally understood what Paul had meant when he wrote that all things work together for good for those called according to his purpose, because I was seeing the mechanism of that cosmic alchemy in action. The tactical lights hit my face, and harsh voices commanded me to step away from the creature with my hands visible, but the Reptilian's clawed hand remained pressed to my forehead for 3 more eternal seconds as he pushed the final sequences into my mind, showing me the face of Jesus with such clarity and power that everything else in existence seemed like shadow in comparison to that radiant truth. In that vision, Christ looked directly at me with eyes that held both infinite gentleness and unshakable authority, and he spoke, without words, that I was now a keeper of mysteries, a steward of revelation that had been hidden for ages but was now being unveiled, because the time of restoration was at hand, and the harvest was ripe, and the laborers, though few, were being equipped with supernatural grace to accomplish impossible things through simple obedience and surrendered availability. The Reptilian's hand finally fell away from my face, and his body collapsed against the concrete floor, even as soldiers surrounded us with weapons raised. But his final telepathic whisper echoed in my consciousness like a bell that would ring forever, telling me that everything I had experienced was true and verified by the only authority that ultimately mattered, and that my life from this moment forward belonged not to myself, but to the mission of awakening that God himself had authored before the foundation of the world, and that though the cost would be high, the reward would be eternal and the joy would be unspeakable, because I would witness the enemy's defeat and humanity's liberation with my own eyes. The soldiers' shouted commands faded into background static as the Reptilian's final gift unfolded within my consciousness like a flower blooming in time-lapse. And suddenly I was no longer in my father's basement, but standing in a vast cosmic expanse where galaxies wheeled overhead like living jewels, and the fabric of creation itself seemed to pulse with intentional rhythm that I recognized as the heartbeat of God. In this space beyond space I saw him, Not the distant grandfather figure of religious paintings, but the Christ who existed before Bethlehem and beyond Calvary, the Logos through whom all things were made and in whom all things held together. And his presence was so overwhelming that I understood immediately why Scripture said no one could see God and live, because the sheer concentrated reality of his being would atomize anything less than fully prepared to receive it. Yet here I stood intact and aware, held in existence by mercy alone, and Christ turned his attention toward me with a focus that made me feel simultaneously like the only person in all creation, and like one small note in an infinite symphony he was conducting with perfect precision. The Reptilian had brought me here, to this place beyond the veil where truth could be transmitted without the distortions of human language or the limitations of earthly perspective. And I realized that this dying being had used his final moments to give me the greatest gift imaginable, a direct encounter with the one who had made us both and loved us both despite the vast differences in our origins and purposes. Through Christ's eyes I saw that the entire cosmos was a stage for divine romance, a grand love story, where God was pursuing relationship with beings capable of choosing him freely, and that earth with all its pain and beauty was the critical theater, where that drama reached its climax, because humanity alone had been designed as the bridge species, physical enough to affect material reality yet spiritual enough to host the very presence of God within mortal flesh. Christ showed me his incarnation from angles that shattered every small theological box I had built around the gospel, and I watched as he descended through dimensional layers that human science had not yet discovered, taking on limitation after limitation until the infinite compressed himself into the finite form of a Jewish baby whose first breath in Bethlehem air was simultaneously a cosmic invasion and the ultimate act of humility. I saw that his mission was far greater than simply paying a legal debt for human sin, though that was gloriously true and eternally sufficient, but that his life and death and resurrection had actually rewritten the spiritual source code of human existence, reactivating capacities that had been shut down since the fall and opening pathways between heaven and earth that had been sealed by humanity's ancient choices and the enemy's strategic deceptions. The cross was not just a blood sacrifice, but a cosmic key, turning in a lock that spanned dimensions, and when Christ declared it is finished, he was not merely dying, but completing an installation process that would allow divine DNA to fully integrate with human biology for all who chose to receive him, making them literal children of God rather than merely forgiven criminals. I wept at the genius of it, the way salvation was both simpler than religion made it and infinitely more profound than casual belief acknowledged, because in accepting Christ a person was not just changing their eternal destination, but activating dormant capacities that transformed them into conduits of heaven's reality into earthly manifestation. The Reptilian had known this truth and had been terrified by it, not because he served darkness, but because he recognized that awakened humans operating in full Christ consciousness would reshape reality itself, bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth not through political power or religious institution, but through ordinary people who finally understood their true identity and authority as sons and daughters of the living God. Through Christ's perspective, I witnessed the spiritual battle that raged constantly just beyond human perception, and I saw that the rogue reptilian faction and every other dark power were ultimately pawns in a larger story they did not control, their schemes and attacks actually serving to refine and strengthen those who turned to God in the midst of trial and persecution. The enemy's greatest weapon was deception, keeping humans ignorant of their divine inheritance and convinced they were merely sophisticated animals subject to biological determinism and material limitation, because a human who believed themselves powerless would never exercise the authority that Christ had restored through his finished work on the cross. I saw prayer as it truly was, not begging a distant deity for favors, but speaking from a heavenly position into earthly circumstance, calling forth the reality that already existed in God's kingdom and manifesting it through faith-filled words and actions that cooperated with the Holy Spirit's movement. The Reptilian had called me a keeper of mysteries, but now I understood that the mystery was simply Christ in me, the hope of glory, that indwelling presence that made me a temple of the Most High and a distributor of divine frequency to everyone I encountered. The vision showed me that millions were waking simultaneously, ordinary people in ordinary places, suddenly recognizing they had been designed for extraordinary purpose, and that this great awakening was unstoppable because God himself had authored it and was bringing it to completion. regardless of human cooperation or resistance from principalities and powers who recognized their time was short. As the vision began to fade and the soldiers' voices grew sharp with urgency, and the reptilian's body went still beneath their tactical lights, I felt the download complete within me like a circuit closing, and I knew with unshakable certainty that everything he had shown me was verified truth that aligned perfectly with Scripture when read with spiritual eyes rather than merely intellectual analysis. Christ's final look toward me carried a commission that needed no verbal articulation, a sending forth that transformed my identity from passive believer to active agent of the kingdom. And I understood that my life from this moment forward would be defined by one simple mission: to carry the activation frequency that would help others remember who they really were and whose they really were. The cost would be high and the opposition would be fierce, and many would call me deceived or crazy or dangerous. But none of that mattered, because I had seen behind the curtain of ordinary existence and witnessed the truth that all creation was groaning for: the revelation of the sons of God who would finally bring heaven's reality to earth through surrendered lives and faith-filled words and love that cast out all fear. The reptilian had died to give me this gift, sacrificing his escape and his life to ensure the knowledge was passed to someone who could carry it forward. And as the soldiers yanked me away from his cooling body, I made a silent vow that his sacrifice would not be wasted, that I would speak this truth regardless of consequence, because humanity's liberation hung in the balance, and the time of restoration was at hand. Dawn was breaking above the farm as they dragged me up the basement stairs, and the morning light hit my face like a benediction, like God himself confirming that darkness was ending and a new day was beginning, and that I had been chosen to announce its arrival to all who had ears to hear. The interrogation room where they held me for 3 days became my upper room of Pentecost, and though they denied me sleep and food and subjected me to questions that circled endlessly back to accusations of treason and harboring enemy combatants, I felt more nourished and rested than I had in years, because the presence that had entered me in that basement moment never left. The lead investigator was a hard-eyed woman named Collins, who seemed genuinely disturbed by the peace she saw in my face, and on the second night she leaned across the metal table and whispered that I should be terrified because people who knew what I knew tended to disappear into black sites from which they never returned. I looked into her exhausted eyes and saw not an enemy, but a daughter of God, who had forgotten her identity. And before I could stop myself, I was telling her that she was deeply loved and that the fear driving her had no power over the truth that wanted to birth itself through her, if she would only open her heart to receive it. She jerked back as if I had struck her and left the room shaking. But I felt the Holy Spirit whisper that a seed had been planted in soil more fertile than appearances suggested, and I understood then that my mission would often look like failure in the moment, but would bear fruit in God's perfect timing, according to purposes I could not yet see. They released me on the 4th morning without explanation or apology, simply opening the door and returning my possessions, as if the entire ordeal had been bureaucratic error. But I knew that someone higher in the chain of command had made a calculated decision that silencing me publicly would draw more attention than letting me go with the implicit threat that I was being watched and should remain quiet. I returned to my farm to find the barn burned to the ground and my father's basement filled with concrete, every trace of the reptilians' presence erased as thoroughly as if he had never existed, except for the knowledge burning in my consciousness like a coal from Isaiah's altar that had touched my lips and purified my speech for prophetic purpose. The neighbors avoided eye contact when I drove past their properties, and the local pastor left a voicemail suggesting I might be more comfortable at a church in the city where my recent experiences would not upset the congregation. And I recognized these rejections as the beginning of the cost that Christ had shown me I would pay for carrying truth that challenged comfortable narratives and confronted the principalities that govern through religious structure as effectively as through secular institution. Yet I felt no bitterness or desire to defend myself, because the vision had shown me that every rejection was actually a divine appointment directing me toward those who were ready to receive what I carried, and that trying to convince the convinced was wasted energy when the hungry were crying out everywhere for bread that religious systems could not provide. I began to write that very night, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee growing cold beside me as words poured out faster than my hands could type, testimony and teaching and prophetic insight flowing from the downloaded database that the Reptilian had installed and that the Holy Spirit was now interpreting and applying with perfect precision to humanity's present moment. Within weeks, I had created a simple website and recorded my first video testimony, speaking directly to camera, with no polish or production value, just raw truth delivered with the authority of one who had seen behind the veil and could no longer pretend that comfortable lies were preferable to liberating reality that demanded response. The response came faster and larger than I had imagined possible, and within months thousands were gathering in the comment sections and private groups, sharing their own experiences of awakening and recognizing in my words the confirmation of what the Holy Spirit had been whispering to them in the secret place of prayer and desperate seeking. I heard from a businessman in Singapore who had encountered a similar being years earlier and had thought himself insane until my testimony gave him framework and courage to step into his calling, and from a grandmother in Ohio who had been seeing visions of Christ's return that aligned perfectly with what the Reptilian had shown me about the unveiling of God's sons and daughters in these final moments before the great harvest. They were not fringe people or unstable minds, but doctors and teachers and engineers and artists, ordinary individuals in whom the extraordinary Spirit of God was moving with increasing intensity, preparing a bride without spot or wrinkle and raising up an army that would take no prisoners, because its only weapon was love and its only strategy was laying down the very lives that Christ had purchased with his blood and was now calling forth for kingdom purpose. I organized small gatherings in homes and parks where we could worship and share testimony and pray for the sick and see the kingdom manifest in signs and wonders that confirmed the word being preached. And every gathering felt like those early church meetings in the book of Acts, where the presence of God was so thick that even unbelievers who wandered and fell on their faces and declared that God was truly among us. The opposition increased proportionally to the fruit, with my website suffering mysterious outages and my social media accounts being suspended for violations of terms that were never clearly specified. But every attempt to silence the message only drove it deeper, underground, where it spread through organic relationship and spirit-led connection that no algorithm could track or censor. Standing now on my front porch watching the sunrise paint the sky in colors that seem more vivid than before that night in the basement, I understand that the Reptilian's death was not tragedy, but triumphant seed planting. His life poured out so that the knowledge he carried could take root in human soil and produce a harvest of awakened believers who would finally bring heaven to earth in the way Christ had always intended. I think of him often with gratitude that transcends the strangeness of our meeting, recognizing that God uses the foolish things to confound the wise and chooses the unlikely vessels to carry the most precious treasure, so that the glory clearly belongs to him alone and not to human wisdom or strength. My mission is simple now, stripped of all religious pretension and reduced to the essence of what Jesus actually did and taught. I awaken those who are ready to remember that they are sons and daughters of the living God, carriers of divine DNA, and authorized representatives of heaven's government on earth through the finished work of the cross and the indwelling presence of the Holy Spirit. The cost has been exactly what Christ showed me it would be: isolation from old systems and misunderstanding from those who mistake their theology for relationship, and rejection from institutions that feel threatened by believers who no longer need their mediation to access the Father. But the joy has been immeasurably greater than the cost, and every person who wakes to their true identity and steps into their kingdom authority makes every sacrifice worth it 1,000 times over, because I have seen the future that is rushing toward us like a freight train of glory, and nothing in hell or earth can stop what God has set in motion through ordinary people who finally believe that with him all things are possible, and that greater works than Jesus did we will do, because he went to the Father and sent his Spirit to make us just like him. What truth has been hidden from you that your spirit knows is real? Subscribe to continue this journey of awakening together.